Thank you. We are the Pension Task Force. And it is August 25th, Wednesday. And just for your information, you're sitting in the very middle, in the back. When you stand up, your head is in front of the screen. Just a warning. I mean, I don't care if your head shows up on YouTube, but okay. So, review from last time. We missed you, Michael.
Thank you.
Anybody comments or concerns or questions that came out of the last meeting?
I have something that came from watching another on YouTube that I thought might be helpful. I noticed Chris, you always say for the record, Chris Wu. And I really thought of that when I was watching a meeting, because we're so small, it's really hard to see who's speaking when you're watching. So it might be nice as we speak to just say our name.
Oh. Right.
I had a thought, just reflecting on some of the conversation around taxpayers paying for public employee pensions, and you know, I want to kind of avoid a us versus them dynamic in terms of when we look at compensation between the private sector and public sector, it's really about total compensation, and pension benefits are a part of providing the compensation to get those adequate, those critical public services provided. And I would love to see it if we could, retirement security, both in the public sector and private sector are an issue though. I would love to see it if we could address that in the report, and potentially look at options that we might be able to look at in the future, like making a secure choice program mandatory, potentially seeding that with state funds when it's available from, you know, when unfunded liability is paid down, to really lift up all people. I mean, retirement, you know, pension benefits and retirement benefits in general are an economic development tool. They stimulate the economy. You know, retirees spend that money that circles into other goods and services. Just you know, I'd really like to look at how we lift all boats up.
Thank you. I will. I think that this is Jeanette. That was Eric.
Oh yeah, sorry.
That we certainly can make a statement to the effect that it would be good to have that. I think that we probably can't go very deep into that, but I think in that report, there's no reason why, if we all agree, we couldn't just make a statement that we would like to encourage that the development and the implementation of that program.
Andrew Emmerich, just a follow up from last meeting. I reached out to Paul Sewell and Dan Dunick, was waiting to hear back, confirm, and they're both available September 9th, just trying to firm up what time works for them, so that they don't both say 10 o'clock, but they're both available for September 9th. Come speak with us.
Yeah.
One will be via Zoom.
Yes, I did get that note from you, and I sent back a reply saying good work, maybe a new sticky, and
Yes.
you suggested you wanted one that smelled,
Yes.
and I couldn't find it.
Thank you for
You mean a
letting me
scratch and sniff?
Yeah,
Oh,
a sticky that smells.
yes.
Those aren't.
know. Just to clarify, they positive smell.
Okay. Other,
Picking up on Andrew's note, kind of on a more technical level, and this is Eric again. I attended a pension conference this Monday and Tuesday, and I had the opportunity to connect with some of the NCPERS folks. We had that conversation last time where they weren't going to be able to make it in. That time wouldn't work for them, but I think they are actually open to coming to speak to us. So maybe we could reach out to them again.
okay.
And
Do you have a name of who you spoke to?
yeah, I spoke to Hank Kim, the executive director. Or it might be the CEO, but the head of the organization.
Thank you.
Here's a copy. I can follow.
Other comments, concerns? Okay. All right, so I don't know, I don't think it's 9:30 yet,
We,
but we,
should we do the, is 20 minutes long enough to introduce the RFP recommendation? Or do you think we should wait?
So
the-
I'll explain it. This is John Gannon. For the record, so Michael and Dan and I met yesterday to review the two proposals we received. We went through the whole evaluation process, except for checking references. So Michael O'Grady this morning sent an email to the treasurer, who both of these firms have worked for the treasurer in the past, one in the 2009 Retirement Commission and one on divestment in 2016. And so we are seeking input from her with respect to which firm she would recommend. We hope to hear from her by lunchtime, and then we'll make our final recommendation to the task force.
Thank you.
so I guess with this, we won't do anything there. Anything else that we need to, whether we should do before, our guests are scheduled to be here at 9:30. They're gonna be here on Zoom. I think that when, not sure that this makes a difference, but if they're on Zoom, we might, if we have questions or comments, I think we're gonna have to really try to project our voices, or maybe even, I might get slapped down here, but when we're speaking, just take off your mask when you're speaking to them and then put it back on, because it is really hard to project and hear through the masks. Is that acceptable, Mike? To do that when you're speaking?
Correct. Yeah, masks are encouraged in the state house for people that are not.
Oh, I thought there was a mandate. No,
It's a strong encouragement.
strongly encouraged. Okay.
Can I say an opportunity, this is an opportunity for compassion for every teacher going back to school, who will be teaching 6.5 hours a day in the mask. It's doing that exact struggle.
Yeah.
I like to look for opportunities for compassion.
Oh, really? Anything else that, before we, what time is it?
9:15.
9:15. Well, we have 15 minutes. If anybody has anything they'd like to talk about before, or we can see if they're ready, but if we schedule them for 9:30, I suspect that's when they'll be there. And that's when the Zoom invite was.
Yeah.
Um,
Mike should be able to alert us.
They're not in Zoom yet. I just sent them the link again just to make sure.
Okay. So. Anything else that anybody would like to?
Well, I mean, I guess we can report that the actuaries come back with the subsidization information, so we just need to put that on the agenda in an upcoming meeting.
Okay.
Let's look at the calendar.
Oh, yes, a little calendar of meetings that we.
So September 9th is our next meeting, and how much time do you think we should spend on that?
Well, it only applies to the state employees, so that's something we should take into consideration. I mean, I think the whole group task force should hear the report, but then we probably should, from that point, how we want to handle it as a task force. Just because it impacts just state employees, not teachers.
So I do have two things that we could talk about right now. Are we not meeting the week of the 27th of September? I don't have a meeting scheduled for that. Okay, we're not. Okay, and then maybe we could take a couple minutes right now to talk about at the last meeting, Dan brought up the question about any public hearing. And I don't know how we want to do that. I've been thinking about that, and I don't know if anybody has suggestions about how that might work. might be nice if we were going to do something, to have one north and one south. And maybe split up the committee so that we didn't all have to go to both of them. But I don't know if that works or not. I have no idea. how people feel.
Are you envisioning trying to find a physical location where we would
I don't know.
meet
Oh,
in,
that's,
like in a gymnasium? I don't even know whether schools are gonna be open to outside. I mean, last school year that there was no outside activities coming into.
I don't
So I don't know
know.
if there's a town hall or anything like that.
We just got word from superintendent, I thought it was a state thing, but it might have been just our district that said that schools can't have gatherings. Maybe that came, that was actually secondhand about a party that was gonna happen. at school that weekend, so.
So maybe we should just think about doing Zoom somehow. I'm fine with that.
I think sometimes Zoom allows for people that wouldn't normally be able to get there because of childcare needs to also participate. Even though I really do like the human element and being in person connecting. I wonder if just function wise, considering the circumstances we're looking at, that Zoom might be most efficient and effective.
When we ought to do this after our draft report, which would have questions and
Yeah, I would say
suggestions. And
mid to late October.
And do we do it in place of a meeting or in addition to a meeting? Yeah,
I would propose an addition, just because our meetings are 9 to 4 and actually getting teachers and state employees and troopers during that time, I think would be.
Okay.
So I'm comfortable adding on an evening time for, that couple of hours.
Guests with us.
okay, well, let's think about that then for some kind of a public hearing about figuring out when exactly and setting up a Zoom for it and doing the outreach. Okay.
Do you want to introduce our guests? Since
Well,
you
only one is there.
No, they're both, they're both there now.
got one picture and one.
Oh, I thought it was a picture. Okay, sorry about that. Okay.
Well, let me first check to make sure that they're there. Good morning, Keith. Good morning, Alex. Are you on now?
Yes.
Oh, there.
Good morning.
There we go. Morning. Let me introduce Keith Brannard, who's the research director for the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, and Alex Brown, who's the research administrator for the National Association of State Retirement Administrators. And so just so you all know, I forwarded them the requests for information that we had from our last meeting. And so I believe they are prepared to talk about pensions this morning. If we want follow-up on OPEC, just given the amount of time they had to prepare, that is something that I don't think they're going to discuss this morning. Keith and Alex, the floor is yours. And thank you very much this morning.
Do I have the ability to share my screen?
Not yet.
We're working on it.
Sorry about that. You both be able to share your screens now.
Did you hear that, Alex? You can share your screen now.
Okay.
And I think that the acoustics in here are not the best, and we all have masks on. We're going to try to project, take off our masks when we're speaking, but if you can't hear us, if people have questions or concerns, please speak up. And I guess the question I would have is, do you want us to ask questions as you go through, or would you like to do your presentation and we reserve questions for when you're done?
We talked about it earlier, and we think that there are some natural transition points in our presentation that where we could pause and ask for questions on the preceding material.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, are you able to see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Well, first, I want to express our appreciation to the task force for your interest in public pension issues in your state and for the opportunity to discuss those issues here with you this morning. This slide provides just a broad overview of how we expect the discussion to unfold this morning. We're going to cover some public pension issues, especially pertinent to Vermont. We'll provide a comparison of benefits between the Vermont state employee system and teachers retirement systems and regional peers per the task force request. We'll talk a little bit about pension reform trends nationally and some of the experience that you've had here in Vermont. And as a part of that pension reform discussion, we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about COLAs, and so we prepared a comparative discussion of COLA arrangements to highlight that plan design element specifically as well. Starting with a broad overview, some summary statistics pertaining to public pensions in Vermont. These statistics are all as of fiscal year 2020. Most of this information is provided by the U.S. Census Bureau. Census counts approximately 5 billion in public pension assets in Vermont, the overwhelming majority of which are held by the state employees and teachers retirement systems. You can see the counts of active members. Active members are those currently working and accruing service credit toward an eventual retirement benefit. And then annuitants are those currently retired and receiving retirement benefits. 248 million in employer pension contributions to Vermont retirement systems made in FY20. 457 million in benefits paid out in FY20, and this is a point that's often lost in the discussion of public pension finance, that there's a lot of money being dispensed by these pension funds on an annual basis, 457 million here in Vermont. And then we've listed the FY 2020 actuarial funding levels for the 3 statewide systems here in Vermont. State employee system, just a little over 66% funded. The teachers retirement system, a little over 51% funded, and the most well-funded system is the statewide municipal system at just under 76% funded as of FY20. So some of the factors that we're going to discuss at the beginning of this presentation are listed here on this slide. Factors working for and against public pension plans improving their funding condition. Among the factors working in favor of public pension plans improving their funding condition, actuarially sufficient and surplus contributions. The surplus contributions would refer to contributions received by public pension plans above the actuarially determined employer contribution rates. Investment returns above assumptions, obviously, is another factor driving improvement in public pension plan funding conditions. More aggressive amortization policies, and we'll get into amortization policy in more detail later on, but more aggressive amortization policy would be a policy that more rapidly eliminates an unfunded liability and therefore creates more rapid improvement in the funding condition of a public pension plan. Participants working longer. If participants work longer, they receive their retirement benefit later and in general for shorter duration. And then as we'll look at in great detail later, pension reforms that reduce unfunded liabilities is another key factor working in favor of public pension plans. A couple things working against public pension plans at the same time. Lower investment return assumptions, which we've seen a number of in recent years, and especially so in recent months. Lower rates of payroll growth. Payroll growth is chiefly determined by the number of public employees and growth in their salaries, both of which have tended to be low, at least in the aggregate or national picture. recently, and lower rates of payroll growth generally correspond to higher required employer contributions. The opposite of participants working longer would be participants retiring sooner. And this is something that we're monitoring, especially pertaining to the pandemic conditions that we're living in, and potential impacts on participant decisions to either retire sooner or delay retirement. But if participants are found to be retiring sooner, then they're going to be receiving that retirement benefit for a longer period of time than they otherwise would if they work longer. And then updated mortality assumptions to reflect improved expectations in life expectancy, to the extent that public pension plans are making corresponding updates to their mortality assumptions. This could add to the liability and cost of the pension plan as well. And so we'll start, we have a number of charts now that we prepare. We like to communicate about these issues through charts primarily. Starting with this first chart, distribution of public pension funding levels for FY20. There are about 120 or so plans indicated on this chart. Each plan is represented by a bubble. The size of the bubbles is roughly proportionate to the size of the plan liabilities. So larger bubbles equal larger plans, smaller bubbles equal smaller plans. The actuarial funding level is the most popular and widely cited metric for assessing the condition of a public pension plan, but it's not the only relevant metric. And in fact, I think this is the only slide in which we discuss directly the funding ratio. But it's good to set the stage and see, especially where two largest statewide plans here in Vermont compare on a national basis. And so you can see the position of the Vermont state employee system and teacher retirement system indicated here on this chart, just to orient you to the position of some other notable public pension plans on this chart. The large bubble there in the center of the chart is the California Public Employees Retirement System, the nation's largest public retirement system. Directly to its left is the California State Teachers Retirement System, second largest, I believe. A couple of the larger bubbles over to the right hand, the upper northwest quadrant of this chart, that are among the largest and most well-funded public pension plans in the country include the Wisconsin Retirement System, the New York State and Local Retirement System, New York State Teachers Retirement System, Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System, South Dakota, North Carolina, and others. And so it's really interesting. We think that when you take the totality of all of the actuarial assumptions and methods, all of the funding conditions, all of the actuarial experience for the largest 120 or so public pension plans in this chart, this is what you get: a fairly wide range from about 40% with one outlier down there below 20% to several plans funded at 85% or greater, and then the median and aggregate in the low 70% funded ratio. So beginning with this slide, we're going to get into the employer contribution experience, and I'd like to ask Keith to take over for a moment.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everybody. Before I get going on this part, any comments or questions to this point? You okay? Okay.
Yes, we have one question.
Great.
One question, just in terms of that last slide, the median funding percentage being about 71% or so. How should we view what is a sort of a healthy funded percentage? There's a wide range there. I'd just be interested in your perspective on that. I mean, obviously 100 or better would be fantastic, but in more practical terms, how should we view what a healthy funded percentage is?
I'll take a shot at that, if I might. And often you will see the benchmark of 80% referred to as an indication of a healthy pension plan. In the public sector, we believe that's a bit of a myth or a misnomer. 80% does have relevance among corporate pension plans that are regulated by the federal government. 80% triggers certain requirements and events for corporate pension plans. Our overarching view with regard to the condition of the public pension plan is that it's problematic if funding the plan continuously going forward is causing fiscal distress for the plan sponsor, for the state and the cities that are providing it. As Alex indicated, the funding ratio is one measure among many. It's the most recognized and popular measure of the condition of a public pension plan. But we would submit that there could be a plan that's funded, say, at 70%, that is actually in better overall condition than a plan that might be funded at, say, 90%. And that has to do with the reason, for among other things, the reasonableness of the actuarial assumptions and methods, the fiscal condition of the plan sponsor, the states and the cities that are sponsoring it, and other factors. So really our metric is whether or not funding the plan adequately is or is not causing fiscal distress.
Thank you.
We have a question.
Just a brief question. On the previous slide, the small bubble below 20%, just curious what that one is. If you can identify that.
Yeah, that's the Kentucky retirement system plan for non-hazardous employees, I believe. Is that right, Keith?
That's correct. When we started this measurement, there was another plan. West Virginia Teachers was funded about that same level. And that was about 20 years ago. And they are now funded right around the median, right around 70%. They've made a concerted effort to pay off their unfunded liability. They've applied a portion of state budget surplus monies to that. They've consistently paid their required contribution and so on. They've not reduced benefits, but they have made a concerted effort to eliminate their unfunded liability.
Molly, did you have a question?
I did.
Use the mic.
I was wondering if the graph seen there is representative.
Hey,
of
Molly,
other-
can you
sorry.
use the mic here?
Yeah,
Because
I
I
just-
think
I'm wondering if the graph that we're looking at is representative of other years. You said you've been doing this about 20 years, or is it changing significantly right now or in recent years?
So we started measuring in fiscal year 01, which was the all-time high in the aggregate for public pension funding levels. They were funded at right around 100%. At that time, there were many plans that were funded at over 100%. And you might recall that during the late 1990s, the investment markets were very strong. There were, I think, 4 consecutive years of double-digit investment return periods. And then there was a very sharp market decline that lasted from 2000 until 2002. And that was followed by another market decline in 2007 to 2009. And as a result, in the aggregate, public pension funding levels have dropped from 2001 at when they were about 100% to now about the low 70s. We would point out, though, that this aggregate funding level has been steady now for 8 or 9 years. Once all of the investment losses of the 08 of the Great Recession and the capital market decline at that time were fully recognized, public pension funding levels in the aggregate have been very stable, right around 72%, give or take a little bit. And of course, these figures don't include the very strong market returns of that were experienced through fiscal 21, which we'll be seeing in the coming years.
Thank you.
So next, we'd like to. Sorry, go ahead.
No, there doesn't seem to be any more questions, so go right ahead.
Thank you. So you all may be familiar with the annual required contribution and the actuarially determined contribution. Those are terms that are provided by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. And the annual required contribution, or ARC, was in effect through fiscal 2014, and it was supplanted in 2015 by the actuarially determined contribution, For all intents and purposes, they're basically the same measure, which is the sum of the normal cost, the cost of the retirement benefit that's accrued each year by plan participants, plus the cost to amortize or pay off the plan's unfunded liability over a period of time. And the fidelity to the ARC or ADC is an indicator of the employer's commitment to funding the pension plan. And you can see 20 years of the experience of the state employees retirement system and the teacher retirement system in receiving its required contributions. And certainly the last decade or so, Vermont has been faithfully funding, at least in some cases more so, its annually actuarially determined contribution. So we took the major.
I have one question. Hold on just
Yes.
a moment. We have one question.
Yes, ma'am. Sure.
Grab-
Member of
grab the
House
mic.
Appropriations.
Corey, can you help with the?
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm a member of House Appropriations. So I'd like to know where you have the last slide. I don't think it represents accurately what we've actually put in. It shows, and I'm now staring at it from afar, but the Vermont State Employees funding 2010, 2009 in the 85 percentile. We put in 100%. I'd like to know where you got that slide from, please.
Normally, we get this information either from an actuarial valuation or a financial report. And we would be happy to go back and check that and get back with you and the committee.
Please.
Yes, sir. So we took that information pertaining to the major statewide plans in every state. We divided the actual amount received into the actuarially determined contribution for each of the major plans in every state plus the District of Columbia over the 19 years that ended in fiscal year 19. That's the latest that we have all of the data. And so each of these bars represents one state. You can see the 100% line there. Vermont is just north of the 100% line. You can see the weighted average and sort of a wide range. New Jersey is the one to the far left, and they have consistently shorted their pension contributions, and they face some challenges with regard to funding their pension plan. But in the last few years, they have been making an earnest effort to get back to full funding. And in fact, in the coming fiscal year, must be the fiscal year that just began, they have for the first time in more than 25 years fully funded their pension contribution. But you can see where Vermont lays out just north of 100% for this time frame.
So I'm going to pick it back up here. Keith mentioned in the slides that he just presented, the component parts that comprise the actuarially determined contribution, the normal cost or the cost to fund an additional year of benefit accruals for current active participants, and the amortization payment to amortize or pay down the unfunded liability in accordance with the plan's amortization schedule. And these next few charts will drill down a little bit on those components for a comparable set of plans to Vermont and look at the Vermont experience as well. So this first chart is presenting the distribution of total normal cost for Social Security eligible general employee and teacher plans for FY20. There are approximately 104 plans on this indicated on this chart, each represented by a bar. The median is just below 12%, and that should be labeled on this chart, but it's between 11.5% and 12%. And then you can see the position of the three statewide plans in Vermont. State employees is normal cost just above the median, 12.7% or so. Municipal system just over 11%, and the state teachers system is below the median at 10.6% approximately. One interesting thing worth noting about this chart, and as of FY20, all of the statewide normal costs for the statewide systems here in Vermont are more or less clustered at or around the median level. If we had produced this chart for FY19, as we did at an earlier presentation to the legislature here in Vermont, these normal cost figures for the statewide plans of Vermont would have been much lower. They would have been congregated around the left-hand side of this chart. But as you all know, you recently reduced the assumed rate of investment return for the pension plans here in Vermont from 7.5% to 7.0%. And that decrease produced a corresponding increase in the normal cost for these plans. But despite that increase, and it's a pretty substantial decrease of the investment return assumption that was enacted, and despite that pretty significant action, your normal cost rates are still more or less around the median for comparable plans. So next, we look at the distribution of total normal costs paid by employees for the same group of Social Security eligible general employee and teacher plans for FY20. And so what this chart is looking at, so as you know, employees make contributions toward the cost of their eventual pension benefits. And what this chart is looking at is the percentage of the normal cost rate, those normal cost rates that we just looked at earlier, that employees are funding themselves through their own contributions. And you can see for two of the statewide systems here in Vermont, the state employees and municipal system, that percentage is over 50%. So employees, so participants in those systems through their own contributions are funding over 1/2 of their eventual retirement benefit, just under 50% for the state teacher system. And then you can see the median here for this group is approximately 49%. The benefit funded through employee contributions. And then this third chart is presenting the distribution of the actuarially determined employer contribution that is directed to amortization of the unfunded liability, again, for that same group of comparative plans for FY20. And so what we're looking at on this chart is the percentage of the total employer's required contribution that is dedicated toward funding the unfunded liability as opposed to funding the normal cost. And so you can see for the median plan, 70% of that required employer contribution is directed to the unfunded liability. And for the plans here in Vermont, the municipal system, which again, as we looked at a couple slides back, is the best funded, most well funded of the three statewide plans here in Vermont. Just a little over 1/2 of the required employer contribution to the municipal system is dedicated to the unfunded liability. And then as the statewide plans decline in funding level, the SERVs was just 66% or so funded, so a little over 70% of required employer contributions to SERVs are dedicated to paying down unfunded liabilities, and 80%, that figure is 80% for the most poorly funded system here in Vermont, the state teachers retirement system. And another way we look at pension costs and employer spending on pensions is to look at the percentage of the pension contributions as a percentage, employer pension contributions as a percentage of all state and local government spending, which is what is reflected here on this chart. This is for FY19, the latest year that this information is available. This information is maintained by the U.S. Census Bureau. And you can see that the median percentage of spending on pensions is just under 4%. The aggregate is about 1 percentage point higher, a little over 5%. The reason that the aggregate is much higher than the median is you've got several large states such as California, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York, whose percentage of spending on pensions is much higher than the median, and therefore is driving that aggregate figure to be higher. You can see the position of Vermont just towards the left-hand side of that chart, just under 3% of all state and local spending in Vermont is represented by employer pension contributions. And this chart invites comparison among states, but there are several considerations that are worth mentioning that are driving differences in these pension spending percentages. Obviously benefit levels vary. Social Security participation or lack thereof is a factor there. Approximately 40% of public school teachers and 2/3 of public safety officers, as well as substantially all public employees in a handful of states are outside Social Security. And they tend to receive higher benefits, and those benefits tend to cost more to fund to compensate for their lack of Social Security participation relative to states whose public employees are participating in Social Security alongside their participation in a public retirement system. So that's a big factor that can drive differences in pension costs among states. Also, levels of unfunded liability is another factor, differences in actuarial assumptions and methods. And as Keith noted a moment ago, employer fidelity to paying the full required cost. It is the case that some employers don't pay what they should toward their pensions. Other employers in other states may be paying much more than they're required to pay. And so those differences in contribution effort, funding discipline can be reflected on this chart. So that's just important to keep in mind.
Okay, I'm going to go again before I do. Any questions?
I think we're all set for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to talk about demographics for a moment. The nation's workforce is maturing. As a nation, we are growing older. As a workforce, we are becoming more mature. And in a retirement sense, maturing means a higher number of those who are receiving a benefit relative to those who are working and contributing to the pension plan. And we've plotted on this chart the ratio of active members, those who are working and contributing to the state employees and teacher retirement systems in Vermont, and compared that ratio to the national average. And you can see a lot of similarity there. Vermont is a little bit below, but definitely in the ballpark. And you can see the change over the last 20 years, beginning at the onset of the measurement period in fiscal year 2001 for the United States as a whole. There were more than 3 active workers in public retirement plans, that's state and local retirement systems, working, contributing relative to each individual who is receiving a benefit, also known as annuitants. In Vermont, those were a little bit lower, but the rate of decline for the nation as a whole has been steeper. And you can see that the 3 lines come close to converging right around 1.2 during at the most recent measurement period, at the end of the measurement period, fiscal year 20. And this has implications for how a pension plan is funded. And we can talk about one of the more important implications with the next slide, please. So cash flow for a public pension plan is a relevant indicator, and that decline in the active to annuitant ratio is a contributor to cash flow. Cash flow is calculated as the non-investment revenue, primarily, if not exclusively, contributions into the plan, minus money out, primarily benefits, also administrative expenses, and then divided into the value of the assets. And so what this chart is showing is that most public pension plans have a negative cash flow. They are paying out each year more in benefits than they're receiving in contributions. This is a figure that generally has been declining, getting lower, in a manner roughly consistent with that chart we looked at a moment ago relating to the active to annuitant ratio. If one were to go back to the 70s and 80s when we were all much younger and we had more people coming into the public sector workforce, getting out of college, relatively fewer retirees, almost every public retirement system had a positive cash flow, some to the tune of 4 or 5%. And in the aggregate, that figure has steadily declined to where you see it here today. A negative cash flow is not necessarily an indication of fiscal distress for a pension plan. It's the normal course of a pension plan. It's something that is expected by your actuaries. If a plan is not receiving its full required contribution, of course, that can contribute to a negative cash flow, and it also can be an indication of fiscal distress, or it can certainly cause fiscal distress. But by itself, a negative cash flow like this is not necessarily problematic. I would point out the one bar on the far left-hand side there, and that is a plan with a positive cash flow, and that plan we mentioned a little bit ago, that's the Kentucky retirement system, and that's the very poorly funded plan. And Kentucky in the last few years has really come to terms, or tried to come to terms with the scope of their problem. And one of the challenges that they were facing was that their payroll was not growing. Their state workforce was not growing. In fact, it was shrinking. And they found that the conventional method of funding their pension plan as a percentage of payroll was inadequate, that payroll was growing so slowly. In fact, it was shrinking, that they were having to increase contributions artificially and significantly in order to adequately fund their plan. So they switched to an actuarial method of funding their pension plan that's based on a consistent dollar amount rather than as a percentage of payroll. And that's why they're up there at 4%. That's just come about in the last year or two. They recognized that they were going to have to infuse more dollars into their pension plan if they were going to eliminate their unfunded liability. And that leads us to talk for a moment about payroll growth. I'd like to analogize for a moment funding a pension plan to paying off a mortgage. And there are a number of similarities, and it's a helpful way to think about eliminating an unfunded liability. So if one were to take out a mortgage and you had a required payment, you might have set the terms of that mortgage based on an expectation that your salary would grow at, say, 3% annually. And then you would begin paying that each year or each month. And that salary that you're making is the basis of the income that you would be using to pay your mortgage. Similarly, public pension plans have an expectation for growth in payroll. And payroll, as you might expect, is the product of the number of participants, active participants working times their salaries. That all adds up to the combined payroll of each plan. And actuaries typically, well, actuaries make an assumption about payroll growth. 3% is a typical assumption. We've seen that come down a little bit recently, but 3% still is most typical. And when payroll growth is not, when payroll growth falls short of the assumption or the expectation, that means basically that the source of income that's being used to fund the pension plan has less than it was anticipated. Again, back to the mortgage analogy, it's like having a salary that is not meeting your expectations, but you still have that required payment. And so as a percentage of payroll, which is the way that you typically will recognize your required employer contribution, that required contribution is going to be higher. And so you can see on this chart, we've plotted what a 3% annual growth would look like going back to fiscal year 09 as the base year. And then we've compared that with the public pension median. That's 113 public pension plans that make up that median. And then we've plotted the state employees and the teacher retirement system. In a payroll sense, the state employees have come much closer to their assumption. As you can see, just falling just short of the 3% annual growth. There are about 6 or 8% more state employees in Vermont today than there were a decade ago. But teachers have a different experience, and there are fewer teachers. I don't remember the percentage, but it's significantly fewer teachers today in Vermont, public school teachers, participating in the plan than there were 10 years ago. And that is reflected in this black line here on the bottom. That's indicating a very slow rate of payroll growth. That's payroll growth probably of around an average about 1% each year. And so as a result, the source of the revenue, or the source of the income, if you will, that the state or its school districts would be using to make its pension contribution is smaller than the actuaries expected. And as a result, the required contribution as a percentage of pay has had to go up. And so that explains part of the reason why the teacher retirement system contribution has had to rise in recent years, is because there's not been much of an increase in their salaries. combined with a declining actual number of public school teachers.
So we're going to shift the focus here to investment return assumption and investment experience. But before we shift focus, I'd like to pause and ask if there are any questions about the preceding material.
Go ahead, Eric.
Thank you both for that information. I think it's very helpful in putting things in context. Related to those graphs that show the distribution of plans, do you have one for employer cost? I saw employee cost there, but just trying to put into perspective the employer costs in Vermont across plans.
So I think the question pertains to the percentage of the total normal cost paid by employees in FY20. And we didn't produce a corresponding chart identifying the percentage produced by employers, but we could. Or it could just be interpreted as the difference between 100% and the percentage paid by employees, would give you the percentage paid by employers.
Alex, could you go back to that? Could you go back to that chart, please, Alex?
There we are.
Yeah, so I was thinking about more, I do have a copy of those 2019 charts. And it is amazing to see how the charts have changed with the assumptions. There's one distribution of employer pension contribution rates. And what it looks to me is like as a percent of payroll across plans. And I'd just be interested in knowing where that is in 2021.
So are you asking how much as a percentage of payroll employees are paying?
No, employers for the two state plans, but really not that in context of all of the other plans.
So you're asking how much employers are contributing across the country as a percentage of pay?
Correct.
So that figure runs a wide range, and just as a reminder, we're talking here only about school teachers and general employees, not including police officers, firefighters, and so on. For Social Security eligible plans in the median, that figure is around 14–15%, and it runs a range from below 10% to 50% and more.
Thank you, Keith. That was my question.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. So go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Keith and Alex. My question, I guess, relates to an earlier graph and then that missed actuarial assumption that we just went through. But it was interesting that Vermont was on the top of the state distribution list in terms of the ARC funding, but we were sort of, I guess, in the bottom percentage in terms of the funding ratio. So I was going to, what explains that? Other than actuarial assumptions, I guess, missed, if anything.
Could be multiple things. We're not sure. That would come out in what's known as an attribution analysis that an actuary would do, but it could be any combination of actuarial experience, that is people living longer than you expect, people retiring sooner than you expect, investment returns that have fallen short of expectations. Those would be the leading culprits. There may be others.
And to that, I would add that on this chart, the experience of the most recent decade in which the state employees and teachers systems in many years have received over 100%, substantially so in several of these years of their required contribution, is most likely driving the very favorable position of Vermont on this chart. But those contributions were made in recent years. Had these surplus contributions been made in the earlier part of this measurement period, then, Vermont's position on this chart probably would still be about where it is currently, but potentially with a higher corresponding funded ratio, because those excess contributions would have had 2 decades to generate investment returns.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Go ahead, Peter. Grab that mic.
Thank you. This is, again, Peter Fagan. You mentioned that as a percentage of payroll, the median nationwide was, I think you said 14%. Is that just pension? Does that include OPEB?
Does not include OPEB. That's pensions for Social Security eligible employees, general employees and teachers.
And I was right when you said 14% median?
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, it's right in there, 14, 15%.
Okay, thank you.
And I should add that, as Alex indicated earlier, not every employer is paying their full required contribution, although in recent years, I think on a national basis, employers have really made a much stronger effort to adequately fund their plans. But also there's variation in actuarial assumptions and other things that affect that. But that's about where it lays out, 14 to 15%. Other questions?
Don't see any other questions.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to shift focus a little bit and talk about the investment return assumption experience and the general investment performance in recent years, beginning with this slide, which identifies the public pension fund sources of revenue for a 30-year period ended in 2020. This is based on information maintained by the U.S. Census Bureau. And this is pretty much how it falls out for any 30-year period that you look at. And we generally update this chart every year. Employee contributions for the 30-year period represent approximately $1 trillion in revenue to public pension funds, or about 12%. So an important source of revenue, certainly a key source of stable and predictable contributions coming into public pension funds, but a relatively small percentage of the overall picture. Employer contributions, we get a little bit higher in terms of dollars and percentage, 2.4 trillion or 28%. But the overwhelming majority of long-term revenue coming into public pension funds is sourced from investment earnings, 60%, a little over 5 trillion. And as I indicated a moment ago, this is pretty consistent for any 30-year period that you look at, 60 to 65% or so of public pension fund revenues are derived from investment earnings. And the reason we like to present this chart is because we think it emphasizes the importance of investment performance and the investment return assumption for public pension funds, given that most of the money that they're taking in is generated by investment earnings. And so then this chart is looking at the
Can we
change.
jump in with one question here? Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you. So again, this is Peter Fagan. I assume you may get to this, but certainly leading into the chart, it would be it's a good lead in. Since this is a rolling 30-year, your previous chart, what is the average annual return and your combined annual growth rate on the investments here that is demonstrated in this chart? Nationwide, obviously.
So I had some difficulty hearing the question, but I think it was asking about the average annual investment return.
Annual return on the investments. In other words, you can use combined annual growth rate as another to ask question. I'm not looking for 3, 5, 10. I just want to know the year average, please.
So we actually have some data on that for different time periods that we might present that and see if that information is responsive to your question. And if not, we can discuss further. But that's coming up in a couple slides.
Great, thank you.
So given the importance of, or given the reliance of public pension funds on investment earnings, that really emphasizes the critical importance of getting the investment return assumption right. And there have been a number of changes in recent years to investment return assumptions, which are identified on this chart. There's a lot going on this chart. Just to orient you a little bit, the different shaded sections of the bars correspond to a number of plans using a specific investment return assumption or an investment return assumption within a specified range corresponding with the labels on the axis. And you can sort of follow the movement from left to right on this chart. And you can see beginning in about FY10, FY11 or so, you see acceleration in the pace of changes to investment return assumptions. And when I say changes, I'm talking about reduced investment return assumptions. And that has pretty much continued all the way until present day. Our data set on investment return assumptions is prospective, so it includes changes that have been announced but have not been reflected in an actuarial valuation yet. And so that's why our data set goes through FY22. And you can see that the median at the beginning of the measurement period was 8%, and it remained at 8% for the better part of a decade or so, and then has begun to steadily decline to 7.5%, 7.25%, to its present level of 7%, which is also the assumed rate of return used for the statewide plans here in Vermont, having just come down from 7.5%. And you can see, just how much of an outlier, you would have been at 7.5% just a little bit previously before making that reduction to 7%, which is now consistent with the median investment return assumption. Sorry.
I'm not sure what that glitch was, but nobody's trying to ask a question. So I think we'll chalk it up to Aaron electronics.
Okay, well, moving on. I mentioned that the period of significant changes to investment return assumptions began in FY 10, 11 or so, corresponding with the, just coming out of the Great Recession, a period of very low interest rates, low inflation, forecasts for expected investment returns across many major asset classes were trending lower. And so that was really driving the decision by many plans to reduce their assumed rate of return, which has, as I mentioned, continued until the present here. We're learning about a new reduction to an assumed rate of return seemingly every week or every couple of weeks. And we expect that activity to continue. So why is this important? Well, as we just saw, the majority of public pension fund revenues are derived from investment earnings, and all else equal, a decrease to the assumed rate of investment return will produce an increase to the employer's required costs. If you're expecting less income to come in from investments, then that means more must be sourced from elsewhere, primarily employer contributions. And as we'll see in a moment, when we look at pension reform, employee contributions have needed to increase as well to correspond for the diminished expectations for investment income. So now we're going to talk about investment performance, and I'll ask Keith to present this section.
Thank you, Alex. So these are investment returns for periods ended 6/30/20. That's the end of your fiscal year, of course, and it's fiscal year a year ago. And we have the data for fiscal year ended 21, but we're focusing on 20 because we're focusing on we have the other data, the actuarial data for the plan for that period as well. And so this is a helpful comparative. You can see for the 1 year period, the Vermont we've taken the Vermont teacher retirement system. There are minor differences, very minor differences in the asset allocation of the 3 statewide funds, and also very minor differences in their returns. We're using the teacher retirement system, but the others have had a very similar experience, a little bit different, but very similar. So you can see where the actual return falls out in the most recent periods, 1 and 5 years. The Vermont plans have outperformed the national median. Over the 10-year period, it's fallen short. I'm certain that falling short there over the 10-year period has been a contributor to the plans, at least in part, of course, to the plan's actuarial condition. And then over the longer time frame, 20 years, it's a poor return relative to the expected return, but compared to the national median, it's very similar.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It is so weird, I haven't spoken from this podium since this was up. I feel like there's something between us. Anyway, welcome. It is a total joy to have you here in our beloved, and I have to say, glorious State House. I am Allison Clarkson. I am one of your 3 Windsor County State Senators, and it is a total pleasure to welcome you back after a year's hiatus. The first years, welcome to you, class of 24. Woohoo! It's wonderful to have the Vermont first years here in our beautiful State House, our living museum, and we're lucky enough to work here normally every day when our short session is in session. We're thrilled that you've chosen law school. Vermont needs your energy, your engagement, your diversity, and that you bring to our small, great little and mighty state. I'm just curious because you are all new to Vermont. I saw most of you are anyway. Some of you are Vermonters. How many of you are from another country? Oh, great. Some, but not as many as we'd hope. In other years, we have more. How many from the West who've been burned east? Okay, great. And how many from the Midwest? Oh, great. And from the South? I'm not sure we want you here, but it's great. It's great. Only just given your vaccination rates. Remember, Vermont is, we're a little nation proud at 85.2% vaccinated. And how many of you are from the East? Great. And how many Vermonters? Woohoo! Great to have you. I too came to Vermont because of the law school. And it was 30 years ago. It's hard to believe, but 30 years ago, my husband, Oliver Goodenough, who some of you will get to know, who's one of your professors at the law school, we changed our lives completely and came up from New York so that he could be and work and make his life at Vermont Law School. Our eldest son, Ward Goodenough, who's class of 15, he came to Vermont as a 2.5-year-old, went away to university, actually went abroad to university, came back here, and is now actually your state's attorney for Windsor County. So be careful in Windsor County. You might consider it a bit unusual